Good evening, everyone. We are joined with Joseph Hinton, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Georgia, and he has generously offered to discuss red wolf recovery and challenges with us tonight. My name is Regan Downey. I'm the Director of Education here at the Wolf Conservation Center, and I'll be facilitating as needed. There will be a question and answer portion at the end of the session. You'll notice there's a question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type any questions you might have, and we'll try to have Joey answer them at the end of his talk. Thank you.
Okay, I'm up now. Good? Okay, cool. All right, greetings, everyone. As Regan mentioned, my name is Joey. I'm a postdoc at the University of Georgia. So I was invited to I guess, give this webinar this evening, mostly because of the proposed rule changes that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has I guess, published last month and are looking to get some public comments from you folks. So part of this presentation is just to give you a background on recovery efforts out there and where there's been some success and discuss the possible implications, I guess, of these proposed rule changes. Just a quick background on myself. I had interned with the Red Wolf Recovery Program back in 2002, right out of college for about a year. Then I did my master's at Rice on red wolves in 2004 through 6. I went back out there again in 2007 as a field technician. And then I started my Ph.D. studying their hybridization with coyotes from 2009 to 2014. After I finished up there, at University of Georgia, I'm a postdoc studying coyotes in Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama, and part of the postdoc is also handling a lot of the data that we still have left over from the PhD work. And so that's mostly my background. That's how I was invited here, obviously. So this talk, like I said, is just going to cover the recovery program's sort of evolution from '87 up to today regarding what's been going on in the peninsula. And most of it is honestly from my perspective as a researcher, along with the data that's actually been collected by the government. And some publications. So to start off with, if I can get this working, there we go. Okay, to begin, you can see here, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on how the species got to where it's at right now. If you need more information on that, there's plenty of it on the internet. I suggest the Red Wolf Coalition or the Wolf Conservation Center here. But essentially, this small red area in coastal Texas and Arizona was the last area where we had remnant red wolves. There was probably maybe a few hundred, if that. There was issues with hybridization. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service went in, captured a handful of them, and sent them off to a captive breeding facility to build up a captive population. By 1980, the species was thought to be biologically extinct in the wild. By 1987, up in this blue area, this is the Albemarle Peninsula of North Carolina, the Fish and Wildlife Service reintroduced a handful of animals to begin recovery efforts there. Currently, the species is listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act here in the US. Globally, it's listed as critically endangered by the IUCN. Right now, there's about 300, 320 individuals left in the world, and most of them are in captivity. There's about 20 or 25 in the wild right now. Currently, the population in North Carolina is listed as a non-essential experimental population under the 10J rule. What that allows the Fish and Wildlife Service to do is to treat the wild population there as a threatened instead of an endangered population. And that provides some flexibility for them to manage them on private lands. So most recently, as most of you may be aware, the Fish and Wildlife Service put out some proposed rule changes. These proposed rule changes aren't much different than what they proposed back in 2016 or what they began back in 2014. The first thing they wanted to do was reduce the recovery area from about 6,500 square kilometers to about 825. This is about a 90% reduction in the recovery area. We peaked with the population around 2005, 2006, to about 155 individuals. Now we're down to about 25 or so, and the Fish and Wildlife Service is proposing to downgrade that to about 15 to 10 animals on the refuge there. So again, another 90% reduction, not just in the size of the area for recovery, but also the size of the population. And what's unique to this proposed rule that wasn't proposed previously is the increased opportunity for people to essentially take wolves off federal lands. So if a red wolf wanders off the Fish and Wildlife Service's wildlife refuge at Alligator River and is on private lands, this rule change will allow landowners to harvest that wolf without any repercussions, as long as they report that collared animal to them. And that's another issue if you think about it. That's a collared animal. That's an animal that they've managed to put a radio collar on. If they have an animal that has no radio collar on them, technically, based on this proposed rule, they don't have to report it. So if Weyerhaeuser is a timber company that owns, I think, about 12% of private lands in the recovery area, they often hunt their property. They often lease their property to hunters. And if a hunter shoots a 62-pound female without a collar, I mean, obviously that's a female wolf. Coyotes don't get that big, but because it lacks a collar, he doesn't have to report it. It's only if it has a radio collar. And that's problematic because you won't know the fate of some of these wolves without collars. And so in my mind, in my opinion, I think the Fish and Wildlife Service is essentially setting the table to terminate the project in North Carolina. I don't see any logical reason for these 3 bullets above as a means to increase the population. So obviously there's other intent here. So what I want to discuss throughout, I guess, this presentation is what I consider the 3 primary challenges to red wolf recovery, and how these challenges have been addressed by the Fish and Wildlife Service throughout the extent of their efforts in North Carolina. So I think what's important is to see how the Fish and Wildlife Service responds to these challenges as they come up. So here, the best way to do this is to look at a timeline and then to plot the population there. And that's what we've done here. So this graph is from a paper we published in Journal of Wildlife Management a few years ago, showing the population trends from 1988 up to 2013. And so in basically 1987, 1988, and 1989, the population consisted of a handful of captive animals that were released by the Fish and Wildlife Service onto Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. That is here in eastern North Carolina. This is the Albemarle Peninsula. This circle here, this red circle, represents the ag fields on Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. That was where the founding pack was established. This is a satellite image of it. So you see all this around it is coastal bottomland forest, and there's some ag fields. So if you get in there, this is what it looks like from the ground. Basically, Alligator River, I think, is about 400 square kilometers of mostly wet coastal bottomland forest that is not very usable for wolves. But this small area of ag fields provides them a foothold to sort of, establish a territory and subsist there. And they have been doing that for almost 30 years now. And so this is probably one of the oldest, most long-standing packs that we have of wolves in North America. This is Yellowstone. This is where we released gray wolves in '95. Quite a difference. So if you take a step back, it's very beautiful, God's country, right? But if you take a step back in Alligator River, what you stumble into is the Dare County landfill. And so there's a considerable amount of talk about wolves being conservation reliant, and I agree. They are relying on what you give them. And if you look at this this table here regarding their diet, the Milltail pack, which is the founding pack on Milltail, in Milltail, in Alligator River, you see that anthropogenic material makes up a substantial proportion of their diet. So if you give them a landfill and you put them in a low quality environment, they'll rely on that. And so it's something to consider when you think about the opportunities we give to these species and how well they can succeed. So we need to put them in good positions to do that. And I think we've done that over time with the wolves in North Carolina, and that's what we're going to cover here. So by 1990, anthropogenic means, for those who don't know, it means human material, like human refuse, garbage. So when I say anthropogenic mortality throughout the talk, that refers to human-caused mortality, gunshots, vehicle collisions, trapping, stuff like that. So if I use anthropogenic, it usually means human-caused. So 1990, we actually start to see these animals begin reproducing. They're dropping pups. And so the captive-born animals are being replaced by wild-born animals. But the first challenge pops up, which is the taxonomy question. Are these actually legit species, or are they a hybrid? And this is a challenge because it can essentially delegitimize the program, particularly with folks in the area. So if they have the Fish and Wildlife Service coming in, reintroducing these animals in an area, and if they don't feel like it's an actual species, that it's a hybrid, they may wind up challenging it on that ground. And that has happened in previous court cases. And that's usually what the rhetoric is now for anti-wolf folks in the area. Basically, they claim that it's not an actual species, that's a glorified souped up coyote, and there's no reason to have them out there. So prior to 1990, the predominant view for the red wolf, its taxonomic status, was that it was a distinct species separate from gray wolves and coyotes. Most of his work was attributed to Ron Nowak and his work during the 70s and into the 80s. He was a Fish and Wildlife Service employee. So this is, basically a Fish and Wildlife Service, backed stance. They're the ones who established this. Some researchers who were geneticists out of UCLA in California had done some mitochondrial work on some of the captive animals and came to the conclusion that red wolves were not a distinct species, that basically they were a hybrid, a cross between gray wolves and coyotes, and this hybridization likely resulted about 300 to 400 years ago. So this is a recent hybrid in the eastern US that resulted from crossing with gray wolves and coyotes. If you look at the literature, the scientific literature that is, during the 1990s, what you see is a back and forth between the folks at UCLA and the Fish and Wildlife Service folks. So you'll see Wayne and his students publish papers calling the wolves hybrids. And then you see Ron Nowak or Mike Phillips or Gary Henry or some other folks with the Fish and Wildlife Service rebutting those. And so what you see going back and forth is the Fish and Wildlife Service taking a strong stance and promoting that this wolf is in fact a unique species, and that's what they're working on preserving. By 2000, a third hypothesis came about, and this is one that's growing a lot. It's getting a lot of traction, and basically establishes that red wolves, eastern wolves, and coyotes are share a common ancestry that's independent of gray wolves. So basically, if you look at this graph here, or this figure, at some point, gray wolves evolved in Eurasia. And then they emigrated into North America. And when they came into North America, who they encountered were red wolves, coyotes, and eastern wolves, which were North American evolved species that evolved here solely in North America. There's some unique haplotypes and genetic material. If you read the papers, you can get in that. As a field biologist, I'm not a geneticist, but as a field biologist, it's important for me to, when I look at these hypotheses about origins and where the red wolf came from, that it corroborates the data that I use in the field. That's a working hypothesis that I can use to explain our findings. I find the two species hypothesis, that is the hybrid origin hypothesis, difficult to use. One of the reasons is because, first of all, there's no hybridization occurring out west with or between gray wolves and coyotes. So when we reintroduced gray wolves into Yellowstone, there's a few of them surrounded by lots of coyotes. We didn't see hybridization between the two species. The same thing with the Mexican wolf. And as animals dispersed out of those gray wolf strongholds into other areas where there was mostly coyotes, a few gray wolves, we again didn't have issues of hybridization. So the same issues we see occurring in the eastern US is not occurring out west. We're not seeing the production of hybrid animals. So something else is going on here out east. And so that's why we tend to fall back more on the three species hypothesis and side with that quite a bit, just because it helps explain what we're seeing. The other thing too is that the fossil record and historic data doesn't suggest, there's no evidence that gray wolves pushed into the eastern US and established populations here. A recent study by Kristen Brensky looked at some pre-Columbian specimens and found no gray wolf genetic material in those animals, in those specimens. So we not only have fossil and historic records indicating that there was no gray wolf presence, we now have genetic data suggesting that there was no gray wolf presence in the southeast. And so with the lack of coyote populations and the lack of gray wolf populations, it's hard to establish how we would have had a hybrid species arise in the southeast. And so, like I said, if it doesn't provide me information to use in the field to explain what I'm seeing, it's not a workable hypothesis. And this is why I tend to side with the three species hypothesis. So, okay, moving forward. The second challenge comes up in 1993. So by the 1990s, what we have are coyotes moving in to the recovery area and colonizing it. And the wolves start interacting with these coyotes. And there's a couple hybridization events. So hybridization is now an issue. And so from 1993 up to about 1999, most of the management is now focused on preventing that. And you see there's a bit of a dip, but then it picks up in the 90s. And in 1999, the Fish and Wildlife Service, in response to this issue, held a workshop in Virginia Beach. This workshop they call the Population Habitat Viability Assessment. And basically what they did was they brought in, all your bigwigs, your eggheads from the universities, Canid experts, genetic experts, management guys. And for like 3 days, they hassled with each other, debated, and they came up with an idea of how to manage hybridization. And what came out of that workshop was this Red Wolf Adaptive Management Plan in '99 that was fully implemented in 2000, and they got the ball rolling on that. And so I'm going to walk you through that to give you an idea of how wolves are managed from, in the face of coyote colonization. So again, here's the peninsula. They established three management zones. You have Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3. In Zone 1, this was the first area they want to achieve certain objectives. Obviously, the first objective is to make sure that all Canid breeding territories established in this area were red wolves. And so if they found any coyotes or any hybrids, they cleared them out and ensured that the wolves were able to occupy that space. Once that zone was clear and they had no presence of coyotes or hybrids, they would jump over to Zone 2, work on clearing that out, and then jump over to Zone 3 and start working that area out. The idea was essentially to push westward with this management and have wolves follow behind it. And they often joked and called it the red wave, effect on the peninsula. And the way that worked was simple. So you can see here, like I mentioned, this is Zone 1 up here. You're looking at the top figure here. What's red are red wolves. What's black is like a mixed pair. It's a red wolf with a coyote paired up. And what's blue is coyotes. And so basically clear that out as you see down here and then jump to Zone 2 and clear this blue thing out. And then you jump to Zone 3 and do that. And so that was effective. And in fact, by 2005, they were doing that. They ran massive trap lines throughout the recovery area, just clearing out areas and getting packs set up. But as you'll see here shortly, they ran into some issues with gunshot mortalities, and that wound up creating a situation where it wasn't so much of a wave as it was puddles of red wolves getting established, and then trying to stitch those puddles together constantly through field methods. So the first step with the adaptive management plan, with trying to work with recovering these animals out here, they focused on breeding pairs. They weren't so interested in solitary individuals bouncing around the recovery area. What they needed to work with was breeding pairs that formed, established a territory, and they were breeding, dropping pups. So once they got those animals radio collared and they established that these two animals, or these three animals had a territory, they would track in during the spring. They would track into the female. They track the female into their territory, the core area, and often find a den. And when they found the den, they would find the pups there, and they would sample the pups. They'd take a blood sample, and they would pit tag the pup so they can identify that pup at a later date when they captured it. And what that genetic, what the blood samples provided was a genetic identification that these were in fact red wolves, and it also supplied information on who the parents were, so that they can confirm who they thought the breeding pairs were in fact those animals. And when they encountered coyotes and hybrids out there, they usually sterilized them and put them back out to hold space. This will prevent fertile coyotes from coming in, establishing territories, and breeding and producing more coyotes. And in the event that a coyote or a hybrid paired with a wolf, because they're sterile, they couldn't produce hybrid litters. So you essentially had a sterile pair holding a territory until you could remove that one coyote or the hybrid and get that wolf to pair up with another wolf. Another factor was that this population is small. Most of the individuals are related to each other. So augment genetic diversity, they relied on the captive facilities to provide individuals to foster as pups into the wild population. And so this helped ensure that there wasn't too many issues with inbreeding, and that the founders were used to establish the captive population were sort of well represented in the wild population. And finally, because you're spreading out across the entire peninsula, part of the adaptive management plan was to establish and maintain working relationships with local landowners. This was obviously not occurring on federal lands. It was predominantly, I would say almost 90% or so on private lands. So what does that entail? Well, one thing is you annually trap and monitor as many animals as possible. In this case, you want to do wolves. This is a photo of me. We use padded foothold traps. You catch the wolf, and then you take it back to a facility, you radio collar it, and then you put it back out. And then from there, the field biologist would fly twice a week to keep tabs on all the animals out there. And during the spring, they would focus on females. And when the females started sort of localizing in a den block, they would track in and find the dens. And then they would, like I said, take a blood sample of the pup and pit tag it. As for coyotes and hybrids, it was the same thing, but we always sterilized. And as I mentioned earlier, using these as placeholders, it prevented hybridization, and it also reduced coyote reproduction and population size around wolf territories. There's been several papers published on whether or not sterile coyote behavior is different, and the fact is it's not. Individuals can maintain pair bonds, so even though they're not producing pups, two individuals will still maintain long-term pair bonds together. Having pups is not vital to that. And if one of those animals die, if we have transients that are already radio collared and sterile, they can move in and acquire that territory. So that's helpful with ensuring that fertile animals aren't moving in. And finally, these placeholders can displace other coyotes that are not sterile, that are coming in basically from the mainland. So what I want to do is walk you through this and show you how this works with a map. It's usually hard for people to sort of visualize what's going on. So this figure right here is showing a territory of what we call the bluestone pack. And if you want to know more about this pack, it's from a paper published in Southeastern Naturalist. The lead author is Chadwick. You can get that information on the Red Wolf Coalition's library online. So the points here are GPS locations showing where this animal basically spent most of the time during a 1.5-year time period. So this is the territory here. And these little circles, these little areas inside what we call the core area. This is where they're spending at least 50% of their time. You know, it's really important for them to, these are basically their rendezvous sites, their day beds, stuff like that. Outside that area, elsewhere is where they're foraging and whatnot. What happened was that two of these animals, the two males wound up getting shot and poached. The female, she disappeared. We have no idea what happened to her. We suspect it was likely she was poached too, and the collar was destroyed. Some folks know to do that. And so what happens when you lose a pack like this area collapses. This is all vacant now, it's open. And so something's gonna come in there and take it over. That's gonna be coyotes or wolves or whatever. The main thing is to be prepared to see what happens. And so fortunately for us, we had this wolf move in. This is a female that was a fostered pup in Milltail, and she dispersed out. When this vacancy opened up, she wound up grabbing the den block for the bluestone pack and establishing a territory there. So that's good news for the recovery program. Great. We lost this wolf pack, and now we have wolves coming in and trying to reoccupy the space. The bad news was that there's so few wolves, coyotes also collapsed in on her too. And so what happens here is that we have a male coyote pair up with her because there was no other male wolves available. So she's trying to establish space, and she's got a mate to protect this area with. And then these other three blobs of points are three other coyote packs that establish territories there. Up here, the blue, green, and purple. And we sterilized all these coyotes. So just to give you an idea, we had 3 wolves, and they got shot and removed. And those 3 wolves got replaced by 2, 4, 6, 7 coyotes and a red wolf. And if we had not sterilized these coyotes, this would have been a breeding territory. So that would have been anywhere from 4 to 6 to 8 animals. Same here, here, and here. And so essentially 3 wolves were essentially preventing 4 packs of coyotes that could have been as many as 24 or so animals. And so that shows you how effective wolves can be with lower in coyote density in the area if they can occupy this kind of space. So regardless, this wolf can't be with this coyote long term. We got to fix that. And so the way to do that is to see what else we have in the landscape. These are GPS locations of other wolves. The areas that are empty here in between them are not empty. We actually do have animals there. They're just VHF collared, and I don't have that data to show up on this map. But the point here is that we need to evaluate the landscape and assess how we're going to fix this situation. This area right here, where I'm showing the silver or light blue locations, was what we call the L block pair. There was 2 wolves. Unfortunately, the female wound up getting mange, and she became displaced and went on her own. That left the male by himself. And he had consorted with a few coyotes, wasn't really pairing up with anything. We didn't know what was going on with him, but at any rate, it gave us an opportunity to try to pair him up with this female wolf. And to do that, I had to go in and remove this coyote. And that's what I did. I removed that coyote, I freed her up. And fortunately, within a few weeks, they wound up pairing up together. And they wound up occupying basically most of the southern area of this territory. So they wound up displacing coyotes from this blue area here, and they acquired all this around here. And so from like 2012, I believe, they had 7 pups. 2013, I think they had 8. And then 2014, I think they had 7 pups. But then he was shot and killed. And so that territory then collapsed. And we lost that. And that's pretty much the situation that the program was dealing with in the mid-2000s as gunshot mortalities became more prevalent and interfering with management. And so as you can imagine, the first year that we trapped this area, that we lost this pack, we didn't run in there like John Wayne and try to figure out what was going on. We allowed the animals to collapse in and sort themselves out, so we had a better picture of what was going on, so we could target our trapping efforts. And then once that was in there, once that stuff settled down, we would go in there and trap. That's year 2. And then once we identified that she was with a coyote, we had to give her another full year to go back in year 3 to remove that animal. So it took 3 years to get to that point where we could pair her up with another wolf. We got 3 good years of reproduction out of her, and then we lost the pack. And so, so this stuff can be really time consuming and tough to do when you have a lot of blood getting thrown around in the environment at these animals. So overall, the results of the Red Wolf Adaptive Management Plan were very good. Over time, as you can see on the timeline I give you, wolves increase. They went from, basically a few dozen to peak at 155 animals across the landscape. Introgression was well below 44%, or 4%. And what that means is, like, out of all the genetic material in the wild population, less than 4% of it was attributed to coyote genetic material, which was a result of one isolated reproductive hybridization event back in '93. We had more red wolf litters than hybrid litters, and most of the hybridization events, as we were showing with that graph, occurred after human-caused mortality occurred. Wolves either getting shot or hit by a car. And so the adaptive management plan worked. And we can see that from here, from 1999, 2000, all the way up to about 2005, it starts to stagnate. And so in 2007, the US Fish and Wildlife Service published their 5-year review, and they said, hey, look, this is what's going on. There's some issues with gunshot mortalities. We need to do something about this. And so what that 5-year review basically said was that they're seeing an accelerated rate in mortality. And most of that mortality was attributed to human-caused stuff, basically gunshot mortalities. And they were seeing that wolves were 7 times more likely to be killed during the deer hunting season between October 15th and December 15th. And adult wolves in particular were 10 times more likely to die during the hunting season. So you have this, this short time period where you have breeders getting shot, and it wasn't good. And the Fish and Wildlife Service signaled that was a problem. So during this time period, basically from like 05 up to about 2014, there was a lot of good research going on in the recovery area. It involved, I think, about 12 universities. Of course, my university, I was at University of Georgia, was one of them. And we provided a lot of good information to the Fish and Wildlife Service to hopefully move management forward and mitigate these effects. One of them they were concerned about was obviously survival and cause-specific mortality, exactly what were wolves dying of, and if it was anthropogenic cause mortality, how do we mitigate for that? Then there was the issue of inbreeding. You have a small isolated population, a lot of them are related to each other. You want to make sure that they're not outbreeding with coyotes because they're closely related to their neighbors, siblings and cousins. So they may breed with coyotes because they're not related to them. So that was a concern. And then finally, the issue with hybridization, they wanted to figure out what was actually facilitating why wolves would hybridize with coyotes. And could we establish if there were reproductive barriers in that population? And that was my PhD work, was the hybridization question. And ultimately, are these threats manageable? Can we do something about them? So to get to the main thing here with the gunshot mortality, if you look at this graph, it's a graph of mean monthly survival rates across the year. And what we see are 2 dips. The first big dip is in October and November. And this corresponds with that deer hunting season. So you see a drop in survival. The other dip is in April and May, and then picks back up. April and May is the spring gobbler season. That's another time of the year when sportsmen are afield with their rifles. And so a lot of this is actually sportsmen seeing wolves and thinking they're coyotes and shooting them. A lot of them is not purposeful, to be honest with you. It's accidental. But the fact that you have thousands of sportsmen afield hunting and with pressure on them to harvest coyotes to sort of relieve that sort of top-down pressure on their game species, some of the wolves are mistaken. At any rate, between 87 and 2014, we found that about 70% of red wolves died before the age of 4. The primary cause of death was gunshots. The problem here with that age is that red wolves, like gray wolves, are delayed dispersers. So the juveniles don't disperse from their natal territories until they're about 2 years of age, right? And so if they're all dying by the time they're 4, they have 2 years left in this environment to breed before something happens. So by the time they're 3, they're setting up shop with another mate and dropping a litter. And then at age 4, the following year, they're getting shot. So they're not getting, because they're not long-lived in this situation. They're not surviving to 7, 8 years of age. They don't have multiple years to acquire enough offspring to stay behind to establish what you traditionally think of as a large wolf pack, where you have 7, 8, maybe 12 individuals. These are small breeders, and they're getting one opportunity to breed, and then they're being shot shortly after. And so they're, no pack structure, not good. And so the question became, okay, if this is an issue, can we show a general trend over time that this is problematic? And we did show that. And so what you see here on this graph on the left is the proportion of red wolf deaths caused by gunshot. So it was very low in 87 and 90, but it gradually picks up by 2014. And most red wolf deaths, about 60% of them, are related to gunshot mortalities. Red wolves aren't going to live forever. So a question you should be asking yourself is, how do you want your red wolves to die? And if you're like anybody, you want them to die natural cause deaths. And when these individuals die, it causes their breeding pairs to break up. And so you see a disbandment of packs and turnover of territories. They're exchanging hands, essentially. In the same way, our houses get handed over to somebody else after we pass on, right? And so early on in the recovery area, this is phase 1, 91 and 98, when there was no issues with coyotes. And in the early stages, you see most of the breakups of packs were caused by natural causes. This could be a wolf moving in and displacing an older breeder and taking over the mate. This could be something as simple as a wolf choking on a deer kidney and dying from some weird thing like that. Sometimes the females die giving birth to pups. It happens. But either way, they're dying naturally. And when they die naturally, overwhelmingly, they're replaced by another wolf. So in phase 2, when we have coyotes going on, we have coyotes coming in and they're shifting management to prevent hybridization. Management comes in. You can see some breakups there due to management because they're trying to manage the issue of coyotes. But it's not until phase 3 where gunshot mortalities become an issue that we actually see anthropogenic causes as the primary reason for breeding pair breakups. And you see a decline in natural breakups. And you have a lot more unknowns, which is probably related to poaching, animals being destroyed, or being killed, and carcasses and collars being discarded. And most of this is occurring during the hunting season, which is problematic because that's the time of the year they're trying to form breeding pairs. And so if you're shooting the available breeders, you're not giving a wolf an opportunity to have another wolf mate there. They're going to quickly pair up with a coyote. And that's why the hybridization follows afterwards. And so that's where my PhD work came in. They're basically trying to figure out what's facilitating this interaction after the gunshot mortalities. And the core thing here, the core behavior here is the monogamous breeding pairing. So coyotes are in the genus Canis with wolves because they're more like wolves than they are different. And one of the core behaviors of Canis is that they form monogamous breeding pairs. So they need a male and a female to form a pair, and they establish a territory and they protect that territory. And they exclude other conspecifics from that area, so they ensure that there's resources available for their offspring. And so if a wolf is going to form, if there's hybridization occurring, it's because a wolf is forming a breeding pair with a coyote and establishing a territory with that coyote. And so that became a question about how to get at this issue. And so a lot of that deals with a sort of mating, and I'll cover that here a little bit in a second. But models have predicted that we absolutely needed a sort of mating to be occurring in the wild population to reduce extinction of that wild population. So if wolves were randomly breeding with whatever was out there, they would quickly assimilate into whatever population was out there, in this case coyotes, and breed themselves out. And so you needed wolves to discriminate from other canids and focus on breeding only with wolves. And luckily, there was a few studies that actually showed that out there. There was a genetic study led by Justin Bowling out of the University of Idaho. They had picked up sort of mating signatures in their data. And we also did, looking at breeding pair formations for our orange paper. And so we were kind of happy to see that. We were seeing that wolves were preferring wolves over coyotes in most situations. And this essentially showed us, or at least gave us some idea that there might be reproductive barriers operating in the population. And if there's reproductive barriers, that shows evidence of evolutionary divergence from coyotes, that, you know, wolves aren't just jumping in and breeding with coyotes readily. So there is discrimination, and that's usually a result of divergence in ecological requirements, which is usually the first step in populations diverging and eventually evolving into new species. And so even though there's this sort of lack of strong discriminatory behaviors in the population, as you can see here, this is a small female coyote that's about 32 pounds or so. And this is a large male wolf that's about 80 pounds. I think he was 79 when I caught him. And the question becomes is, you know, it's kind of odd that a large, almost 80-pound animal would try to pair up with something that's small, that's about 30, 32 pounds. And how do they make that work when they should be pairing up with females that are more like 60 pounds? And so ideally, you know, body size is the most distinguishing feature between these two species. And that trait usually drives other behaviors, in this case, space use and prey use. Obviously, if you're a large wolf, you can't subsist off small mammals and fruit. You actually need a high calorie diet. And so you'll focus on larger species like white-tailed deer and rabbits. The other thing too is with space use, if you're bigger, you have to roam a larger area to acquire those calories that you need for survival. And so large animals are going to need more space and larger prey. And so so you're asking, how do the wolves and coyotes reconcile that when they're trying to consort and form breeding pairs? And particularly, we were interested in seeing how that would work out, right? So if they're trying to work things out for a few weeks, you know, the coyote only wants to defend 20 square kilometers and wants to eat primarily small mammals, and you have a larger wolf that needs to defend and protect 80 square kilometers and needs to focus on white-tailed deer. Obviously, they're going to, you know, have conflict in that relationship, and they eventually divorce. And we have seen that. You know, you'll see a large animal try to run with a small coyote, and after about 6 to 8 weeks, they wind up breaking apart and walking away. It always doesn't work out. And so what we did was we took long-term data from the Fish and Wildlife Service, that, you know, from the packs that they had out there from like 1987 all the way up to like 2014. And we looked at what we call conspecific, which is red wolf breeding pairs, and congeneric, which is a red wolf coyote breeding pair, and sort of compared the situations that sort of resulted in their pair formations. So we looked at the sex of the animal, the size ratio between the mates, the home ring size, the wolf to coyote ratio, which is basically the number of wolves and coyotes in that area when the pair formed, pack size, and then whether or not human caused mortality had occurred beforehand. And so these weren't just randomly selected covariants. If you look here, it says sources. These are all the publications that discuss these factors and how they play a role in both red wolf and eastern wolf hybridization. And it's in our recent paper in Ecology and Evolution. Again, the Red Wolf Coalition has a library. These papers are available there, and you can read more into these covariants there. And so what we found basically was that most wolves above 60 pounds did not pair with coyotes. It was largely animals that were like 52, 55 pounds that formed breeding pairs with coyotes. And so what we saw was the sort of size, the sort of mating that occurred based on body size. And there was 3 general hypotheses that we see play out throughout nature quite widely that were used to explain this in our paper. One is mate availability, and that's just common sense. I mean, if you don't have available mates, you're going to breed with the next best thing, which in this case is coyotes. That's where they can make it work. But if there was wolves there, they would breed with wolves. But if there's no wolves, they're going to breed with coyotes. The second thing related back to what we were mentioning about mating constraints. And so coyotes do things differently than wolves do. And so when a wolf is trying to pair bond with that coyote, if they can't make it work, then there's a constraint there, and they wind up essentially divorcing after a few weeks or after a few months and walking away from each other. So these large males have a hard time finding mates out there. They just have a hard time pair bonding with these small coyotes. it's the female wolves that had a higher success of pairing with coyotes, because you would have a small 52-pound female that could find a 40 or 42-pound male coyote, and they could work together. She could maintain a small territory and maintain a diet mostly of rabbits and small mammals, and they could work with each other. And so they reconcile their differences and maintain long-term pair bonding that creates hybrids. And so ultimately what we are seeing is this size assortative mating, which is the most predominant means of assortative mating occurring in any taxonomic group for animals. Big animals usually pair bond with big animals, and small animals stay with small animals for obvious reasons. So this is an important finding. It shows that body mass is an important reproductive barrier that could reduce hybridization. And this has important implications for management, right? Because if recovery is your goal, you essentially want to go from 150 wolves up to 200 to 500, whatever. You have to reach those objectives to delist the species. As you acquire more wolves, a larger abundance of them on the landscape, you have more territories, and it's very difficult to use the fine scale practices of going in and sterilizing and chipping and doing all that stuff. And so you want to make sure that there are behaviors there in the wild population that ensure that as you pull back, the wolf is stepping up and doing their side of the job, I guess, and preventing hybridization. And now that we know that there are some behaviors there, we can focus management on that now. One of the ways to do that is ensure that red wolves compete with other red wolves for space and mates. And that facilitates competition between red wolves with other red wolves. If body size is an important trait, the only way they're going to contain and maintain a large body size is if they're competing with other large animals for mates and acquiring space. You know, coyotes in the recovery area are not breaking 50 pounds, and neither are the hybrids. They're usually very small, 30 to 45 pound range. And so a small female or small male that's in the 50 to 60 pound range has a selective advantage over acquiring space that they can protect from coyotes and hybrids. But that advantage at that weight is lost if they're predominantly surrounded by other wolves that are much larger than they are. So that's why you want wolves competing with other wolves out there. It creates selection pressures for larger animals. And ultimately, anthropogenic mortality is driving this hybridization because it's setting the table for the wolves to not find red wolves, because it lowers the red wolf density and increases coyote density. And so what we have proposed in our publications, and we suggest this with the Fish and Wildlife Service now, is to adopt a similar approach that's been taken in Canada and Ontario to protect eastern wolves on Algonquin National Park, where they maintain a preserve there. They have, I think, about 250 to 300 eastern wolves there. They're packed in and occupy most of the park, and they don't allow coyotes to come in and establish territories there. So there's very few coyotes in that area. The hybridization between eastern wolves and coyotes usually occur outside that park. And so what we were doing at this time period, working closely with Fish and Wildlife Service, the Red Wolf Recovery Program, that is, was discussing how do we start to build a population focused on key processes. Something that's just not a biological or an administrative head count of wolves in the landscape. It was actually a functional biological population. And a lot of that focused on how they were maintaining territories, how you have immigration among packs and replacing wolves on the landscape that died, and then focusing on key traits that allowed those processes to occur, and when issues arise in the field, how to best tackle them. And so, the focus on these key threats that disrupt that process, obviously, you have to resolve issues of human-caused mortality. You have to do that through policy and conflict resolution approaches with landowners, hunters, even with the highways. I mean, obviously, cars are a threat too at times. So one of the ways to do that is to actually reevaluate this species survival plan and the Red Wolf Adaptive Management Plan and improve it to expand management capabilities. And that's where we were in 2012, 2013 with this stuff going on. But in 2014, litigation starts. And this is where the Fish and Wildlife Service does about a 180 on their position with the population in North Carolina. As the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission is sued over nighttime hunting. Again, I'm not going to get into that. You can refer to the groups that I mentioned for more information on that. The main thing here to know is how the Fish and Wildlife Service responded after litigation with these agencies began to occur. And the first thing they did was they ceased implementing the Red Wolf Adaptive Management Plan. And so this essentially stopped managing wolves on private lands. They stopped sterilizing coyotes. They stopped managing coyotes and hybrids. And they stopped fostering captive animals to the wild population. I believe they cut their budget, so they reduced, I basically reduced the budget to manage wolves out there. And when biologists had left the recovery program, they didn't refill vacancies. So in one case, Chris Lukash passed away. His spot's not refilled. Ford and Art left. I think Becky left. I'm trying to think who else left, but they haven't refilled those vacancies. And so obviously a reduced budget and not putting more biologists on the ground, along with reducing the management options they have, you're not going to be able to sustain that population out there. The other thing they did was they issued take permits to landowners. And that actually resulted in a lawsuit against the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is why they're in court right now. One of these permits was used to kill a female who was lactating, and they never found the litter, but they assumed the pups were lost because of that. And so in 2016, in the middle of this litigation, it's still ongoing. The Fish and Wildlife Service made some other proposed rules to pull back the recovery efforts. And they want to focus on the captive population. But the injunction that the federal judge put on the Fish and Wildlife Service prevents them from removing wolves from private lands right now. So even though they want to back out and basically retreat to the refuge and maintain a small population, the few wolves that are still on private lands, they can't go and grab and pull off those private lands. So they're there, they can't remove them. But despite the injunction, they still haven't managed to reduce the population from about 110 wolves down to about 20 or 25 now. And so that's what's happening here from 2014 to 2018. And so these proposed rule changes want to maintain this level here for however long, I don't know. But the idea here in my head is that they want to eventually terminate the project. And so they're going to maintain a low population until they find an environment that's suitable for terminating the project and moving on. And so I suspect the proposed rule changes that you guys have an opportunity to respond to, you can either support this if you don't want the wolves there, or you can oppose it if you want the wolves to move forward, the Fish and Wildlife Service to move forward with recovery. That's your choice. But that's the whole point of the data that I've been showing you, is that they have successfully managed a population over 30 years on the peninsula. And then the main argument that the Fish and Wildlife Service is using here is the lack of local support. And that's the next couple slides I'm going to go through covering that. So as a researcher who's been out there for, I don't know, almost 15 years or whatever it is, 2002 to 2014, that's 12. Basically, I had a lot of access to private lands. Access to private lands was never a serious problem for us. Our academic studies demonstrate that. And this issue was never raised in any academic or government publications prior to 2014, to that litigation period. So what you're looking at here is a figure from Adams et al., which is a genetic study on red wolves and molecular ecology. And these are all the areas in the recovery area that they sampled from. So Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge and Gator are public lands, but Mesquite Airport, Ventures, Carmer, Buckridge, and Columbia are not public lands. Those are private lands, as are Cross Landing, Rich, and Agra East. Researchers are not accessing this property unless they got permission to. These properties are gated, so they have to have access to that, and they're coordinating with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Another study, Chadwick, Southeastern Naturalist. This is Kilkenny, private land. This is south of Pocosin Lakes, private land. This is Bluestone. We just showed that pack a few slides back. It shot up and replaced with coyotes. That's private land. I actually trapped that area. So I know that area really well. Again, Dellinger's paper on diet. So this is properties he had access to packs on private lands. Timberlake, private. Columbia, private. Tyson, private. Northern, private. Kilkenny, private. Lots of private land. This is Justin McVeigh. He was a master's student who was funded by the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission to assess coyote and red wolf diet. The yellow areas are the areas that he sampled. This is private land, 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 this is private land. Lots of private land. This is from Giese and Terletsky. These are all sterile territory, or all territories of sterile coyotes. Lots of private, lots of territories on private lands. This is Bowling, where he sampled from. Obviously right here is Milltail, that's public land, but as he starts to swing out and push out of the recovery area, he's on private lands. He's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service truck, government truck, and he's got keys and access to properties. And finally, here's coyotes captured by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service between 1999 and 2013. And you can see widespread access across the peninsula on capturing coyotes, sterilizing them and putting them back out. And they wouldn't have that kind of spread on their trap lines unless they had permission to be on those properties and working with landowners. And one of the things that's indicates that they had this support is the responsive management plan that the Fish and Wildlife Service had conducted in 2016. That plan found that about 15% of the landowners didn't believe that the red wolves were a problem. So 85% of the landowners out of about 2,600 that were surveyed found that the red wolves were either supported by those landowners or they were indifferent to them. Either way, that provided the groundwork or the footwork or whatever to get the biologists on properties to work with the landowners and get access. So this goes into coyote management. If the recovery program was managing coyotes for almost a 14-year period, they've got a lot of good data on what's going on with coyotes out there. So looking at their data preliminarily, data suggests that about 400 coyotes were captured in that period. 65% were captured in agricultural fields, which is these tan areas across the peninsula. That's all private land. Most of that's not on federal or state land. 60% of those coyotes were released as sterile placeholders, meaning the other 40% were euthanized and not put back out. And a lot of that is actually at the request of landowners at times. And so by 2013, looking at the trap line data, the red wolf to coyote, or the coyote to red wolf ratio is about 2 to 1. So for every red wolf we had out there in 2013, we had 2 coyotes. If you include hybrids, it's 2.5. I guess a liberal sort of estimate would be about 3 to 4 to 1. But either way, it's still a low estimate for a ratio. And what's interesting, the leading cause of death for these radiocollar coyotes were actually the biologists themselves. 63% of them were killed by the biologists to create room for these wolves, followed by gunshot, vehicles, and natural causes. And so the primary threat to the survival of a radiocollar coyote was actually a red wolf biologist and not a landowner. What's interesting is looking at the trapline data, the coyote density is about 0.04 per square kilometer. That's very similar to what you would see as far as density in the Yukon or the northern latitude of coyote populations in Canada and Alaska. So coyote density is quite low on the peninsula. And that was a result of wolves establishing territories and preventing them from occupying large portions of the peninsula, and along with the sterilization, right? So instead of having packs of 6 or 8 coyotes, you had breeding pairs of 2. And so that shows how successful management was. So this data wasn't used in the species survival or species status assessment that was just published recently by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Instead, they relied on the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission's Hunter Harvest Survey. And so if you look here, N stands for the number of survey respondents. That's the number of people that responded to these surveys. And this is the total sum of what they reported of them harvesting coyotes. So in 2010, 2011, 8 guys said they killed 630 coyotes on that peninsula. 19 killed 670, so on and so on and so on. These are, I don't know how to put it, but this data is, I guess, alarming. I'm trying to be polite here. Yeah, there's no way that the biologists could themselves remove 65% of their own radiocollared animals if you had this kind of kill rate in the background behind them. And so there's probably some issue with the accuracy of these survey respondents that need to be checked. That's all I can say on that issue. There's just no way 8 dudes killed 630 coyotes in 2010, 2011. It's just not possible. So, how can the recovery program maintain such widespread management of coyotes and counter this data here as, anyway. The one way is to look at the responsive management plan, right? They went out and surveyed almost 2,600 people on the peninsula. And what they found was nearly 70% of residents said that the coyotes do not cause me any problems. Of the 30% that felt like they caused problems, only 16% would actually do something about it with their rifle. The other 40% said we wouldn't take any action. And so only 11% claimed to have taken action. This actually corroborates what we kind of see here. So about 11% of those radiocollar coyotes were killed by gunshot. Now, I'm not saying this is a cause and effect or how strong this correlation is. It's just a coincidence that it's 11% and 11%. It just shows that there is low concern by the landowners surveyed in here that they were concerned about coyotes. And this is important because this is how, again, we gained access to properties, that the local landowners weren't, overly sensitive to coyote presence and want to take things into their own hands, that they were willing to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service and allow researchers access to the properties. And so this leads us into whether or not the program has strong support from locals. And one of the things I try to point out is that based on my experience working with the populations out there is that support by locals and access to their property is not synonymous. At times, we didn't have access to properties of folks who supported red wolves. They may have had another beef with the Fish and Wildlife Service about something. In some cases, their property abuts next to the refuge, and they have issues with flooding on their ag fields. And so they're kind of pissed at the Fish and Wildlife Service, but they don't have any beef with the recovery program. And so they would deny us or deny them access to their property to manage wolves and maybe threaten for a take permit as a bargaining chip to get the Fish and Wildlife Service maybe to pay some attention to them about their needs with the flooding. Other times, we may have not been allowed on a property because the neighbor is nosy and would, make a big fuss about federal trucks on the dude's property. He's like, well, I'm okay with the program. I'm okay with the wolves, but my neighbor's a bit of a jerk. I kind of don't want to get him in my ear jawing about this stuff. And so, stuff like that would come up. Other times we would have people who didn't support the program, didn't like the wolves, give us access and allow us to manage wolves in the property. In one case, I was going after a wolf in Washington County. Part of their territory was on a property that the guy was adamant he didn't want the wolves on his property. He managed the property for hunting, specifically deer and rabbits, and he thought it was a bad business model to have predators on his property. But he gave me access to get the wolves. The problem here for him was that the wolf territory not only encompassed his property, but it also encompassed Weyerhaeuser timberlands. And so the company we had a co-op agreement with, and so the Fish and Wildlife Service to manage wolves on their property, and his neighbor was very supportive of the program. So I ran trap lines through 3 properties to get these wolves up. And the deal with this guy was, well, if you get a wolf up on my property, I don't want it back on my property, go dump it somewhere else. But if it comes back, whatever, I just don't like them. And so we had issues like that. So sometimes non-supporters weren't that bad. They just didn't like the program. They felt it was a waste of money, or that the wolf wasn't really a wolf, it was a hybrid. But at the end of the day, they didn't lose any sleep whether or not the animal was there. And a good example of this, where you don't see support and access sort of aligned with each other, would be this outlying landing field. So in the mid-2000s, DOD wanted to put a landing field in Washington County. And if you were to go into those counties, they would pull out strong support for the military. But when it came to actually having military come in and being in the backyard, they weren't for it. So here's a situation where access and support sort of don't go together. And what's interesting about this issue was red wolves were used in court and as a viable resource that would be threatened by the presence of these jets in the landing field. And so red wolves were used and along with the Atlantic Flyway to stop DOD from building this airfield out there, and essentially prevented them from acquiring or save the hunter farms, basically. So when people ask you, like, what good is a red wolf? Well, if you were in that OLF zone, they kind of saved your farm, possibly, because of what happened. So that's what good they are. Anyway, to finish up here, what I suspect, or what I would like for the Fish and Wildlife Service to do is just be more transparent about how they're evaluating local support. This wolf right here was an animal that we put in a soft pen on private land. The landowners were very supportive of the program, but there was a petition put out to have the Fish and Wildlife Service remove wolves from their property. And while we're setting up this pen and getting this wolf ready to be released on his property, he also signed that petition to have that wolf removed from his property. So it made no sense, and it made no sense because he didn't know what he was signing. He thought he was signing a petition allowing him to have some control over harvesting coyotes on his property. So a lot of this stuff can be a bit confusing for the locals. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service has a responsibility, I think, to really clarify this, not just for them, but also for the general public, because this is a public resource and you guys have a right to this resource and a say in what happens to it. So one of the things I think they need to do is to show us what their thresholds are in these proposed rule changes. So if they're saying that the local support is wavering and they're concerned that they can't do this without local support, what is that threshold? Is it 25%? Is it 50%? What is it exactly? What number is exactly giving them heartburn, and how can we fix that? And again, like I said, support doesn't actually mean you have access to the property. So if they're saying they don't have enough land for the species to recover on the peninsula, then they also need to provide the percentage of land that they're being denied access to. So if there's 6,000 square kilometers to work with to provide land for the population, it would be nice to know how much of that land they're actually being told no to. If it's like 500 square kilometers of poor habitat, that's not going to be an impediment to recovery. You're not going to have 100% support out there, and you're not going to have 100% access to land. So it's nice to know what are the thresholds for them to walk away and whatnot. And I think that's I think you guys get my point there. And finally, a lot of this discussion is looking at the wolf in a vacuum on its own. And so it would be nice to see, given the accumulation or the number of issues out there environmentally, how the red wolf stacks up with other potential issues. If you just speak about wolves on their own, you may find negativity about the wolf. But if you actually compare the wolf to other issues like flooding or issues with their crops or whatever, you may find that the wolf actually ranks out pretty low and it's not a problem. It's the same thing with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. If they feel like they're losing legitimacy, what do you mean by that? I mean, are you losing legitimacy compared to what? Department of Defense, Department of Agriculture, Department of Transportation? If you need to put this into some context so that we can, as the public, evaluate how you're making this decision. And I think at least what I'm going to do when I prep my letter or response to the Fish and Wildlife Service, I'm going to focus on these things. And these are the things I would suggest that, some folks also do. Ask the Fish and Wildlife Service to be more transparent of what they mean by local support and access so that they can clear that for you. And with that, I'm going to close up here and take whatever questions. I appreciate the time you guys put in here. I know I kept you for about an hour, so have at it.
Okay, so again, for anyone who might have joined midway through or missed the introduction to the program, we're here with Joey Hinton, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Georgia, and he just finished his talk on the red wolf recovery program and challenges facing red wolf recovery in the wild. We do have a few questions that popped up throughout the program. So I do have some of them here, and I'll start posing the questions. In the meantime, if you do have questions you'd like to ask, feel free to use your question and answer section or the chat function to ask your questions as well. So a question that arose quite a bit was, are there other potential reintroduction areas? And if not, what might be the challenges of establishing another reintroduction area for red wolves?
Okay, good question. The answer is yes and no. Yes, there's obviously other areas that we can put these wolves into. In my experience, these wolves can go anywhere, to be honest with you, except like downtown New York. I clarify that. The issue here is that they'll adapt and adjust to the local environment. The issue that we've run into in a lot of places is there's not political space for them. There's enough people with good political connections that could oppose the program and essentially force the Fish and Wildlife Service to either not look there or abandon efforts or whatnot. So for a long time, they had spoken about some areas in South Carolina, and recently there's been some talks about the Ozarks and I think Arkansas. That could work if they have local support, but ultimately you're going to have to figure out a way to mitigate human-caused mortality, right? As you can put wolves into a highly productive area with good habitat and lots of deer, but if they're suffering high mortality due to gunshot mortalities or gunshot, whatever, if they're dying due to gunshot mortalities, then that's an issue. So you have to fix that. And once you fix the human problem, then you can put the wolf, I think, in most areas of the US. The primary issue with the Eastern US that you don't have out West is that it's mostly fragmented, privately owned lands. We don't have that big Yellowstone or Glacier National Park or anything like that. So you're gonna have to figure out a way to manage these animals in politically contentious situations. But that doesn't mean you do it. I mean, you don't do it, you go ahead and do it. That's your responsibility as the Fish and Wildlife Service is to do this. It's mandated to recover these endangered species.
Thank you, Joey. And there's another question that relates to that. The question was, who owns the property where red wolves are right now in North Carolina?
Okay. A little bit of everybody. So obviously you're going to have three primary landowners. You got the feds, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Department of Defense. They have a bombing range out there. Then you're going to have the state agency, or the state's going to have land, whether that's a county park or game lands for the commission or something like that. And the third one's private landowners. And the private landowners could vary. You have local guys who live there. They manage the property the way they want to manage it, whether it's a farm or a hunting preserve or whatever. Then you have your absentee landowners. These are people who live outside the county or outside the state, and they own land there. And so they manage it for whatever they use it for. And then, of course, you have corporate folks who own it, like Weyerhaeuser. Weyerhaeuser owns, I think, like 12% of the lands out there. So it's a little bit of everybody, to be honest with you. And for the wolves, most of that productive land is private. So they're off the federal lands, but there is some packs that are on federal lands.
Can you touch briefly on the Smoky Mountain releases and the challenges that those wolves faced, and then kind of discuss why that program might have ended?
Okay, yeah. So the Smoky Mountain reintroduction, the Tennessee project, started in, I think, 91, 92, ended like around 97 or so, 98 maybe. The issue was that they placed the wolves in the Smoky Mountains in high elevation areas. And so when you have drastic changes in elevation, you have poor soils, poor vegetation, and you don't have a whole lot of prey. And so the wolves that were released on the National Park Service land, just like North Carolina, left the federal lands and went down in elevation into the agricultural cattle areas, and basically were using private lands. The Fish and Wildlife Service hadn't worked out co-op agreements or whatever with the local landowners, so they had to go out and catch these wolves, bring them back to the Park Service land, cut them loose, and of course they would leave. And there was this constant chasing down wolves and bringing them back and dropping them on the Park Service land. And of course, because of this and the low prey productivity in that area, they weren't successful in reproducing. So they didn't have any successful litters in the Park Service property in the Smokies. And so that resulted in them terminating the program.
How would the ecosystem be affected if there were no wild red wolves, or would it not be affected, and would coyotes just fill the vacancy?
Yeah, that's another good question. And to sort of be realistic about that, when you reduce it down to about 10 to 15 wolves, you're not going to have any effect, right? So you actually need a full actual population of wolves, maybe a few hundred out there before you start seeing their effect. And a lot of that effect is going to be on moving the deer population around, lowering the deer densities in those areas that would promote less consumption of plant material and the effects that deer have. It also may have a benefit on the local farmers. Deer damage to crops is always an issue. So if you have wolves on your farm, they could be pushing a deer off and predating on them at the same time, lowering that effect. So there's a big positive effect there, obviously. But coyotes are not going to fill that niche. Red wolves feed on white-tailed deer year-round. There's no change month to month in their consumption of deer. Coyotes, on the other hand, show a lot of seasonal variation in their use of deer. Most of their use appears to be fawns and not adults. And so the wolves are targeting certain portions of the deer population that coyotes wouldn't. So they would actually have a different effect on deer behavior and deer dynamics for that reason. If you remove that large body size from the landscape, obviously coyotes aren't going to be able to fill it. They're not going to, a 30-pound animal is not going to do the same thing that a 60 or 70-pound animal can do, for obvious reasons.
How many individual red wolves are needed to maintain a recovery program? And how long can the captive population be viable without reintroduction into the wild?
Another good question. Okay, so as far as the wild population, the 220 that's mandated like by the Fish and Wildlife Service, like species survival plan, is just an administrative thing. They based it on some population viability assessments, but honestly, in my experience managing wolves and coyotes throughout the Southeast, I would think that you would probably need a few hundred, like 300 or so, to actually get a biological functioning population out there where the wolves are self-sustaining. I think 100, 150 is too few, and it's going to require ongoing management. And that's an easy fix. You just expand the recovery area, pick up a few more counties, and you actually build the population up to 300 to 500 or whatever. With regards to what was the other part?
How long can the captive population be viable?
Okay, so that's a good question too. I'm not sure. I'm not someone who works with the captive population. I would expect in perpetuity, as long as they mix them up right and they avoid inbreeding issues, they could keep them in captivity for a long time. The downside to that is that at some point it becomes artificial selection. And these animals wind up becoming a product of the system that's moving them around and ensuring that they're not inbred and whatnot. So the best thing to do is just establish the required 3 or 4 populations in the wild to get a wild population, and then you maintain a small captive population for educational purposes.
In the proposed rule, U.S. Fish and Wildlife states that any take of collared wolves must be reported. Is this a current requirement, or would it only take place in the proposed rule?
So yeah, if they shoot a wolf with a radio collar, they have to report it, absolutely. As is now, it's illegal right now with the injunction to take a wolf. But prior to all this happening in 2014, if a wolf was shot and killed with a radio collar, yeah, folks were calling in and the law enforcement would come out and assess it. And overwhelmingly, I think like in all but one case, nobody was prosecuted. And in most cases, it was honest mistakes. You know, somebody thought it was, honestly, we've had wolves shot because a hunter thought they were a deer. And the guy was, you know, in situations like this, the hunter's really broken up about it and concerned, and, you know, they don't prosecute because it was an honest mistake. But with this situation, they have 24 hours to report. Yeah, I mean, that's essentially the same situation we have now. The only difference is that you're not supposed to shoot a wolf. And in this case, they're giving them the opportunity to shoot the wolf and say, hey, I shot your wolf, it had a collar, whereas before, they can't do that. You're not supposed to shoot wolves.
Going off of that question, should Fish and Wildlife Service be working more diligently to save red wolves, considering many people still support the program?
Oh yeah, that's an easy answer. Yes, they should be, absolutely, in my mind. They should be working closely with, I think, these NGOs and the public to sort of help with managing the population in North Carolina. When I first started out there, it was pretty lonely. Not too many people were paying attention to the wolf in like 2002, 2003. It wasn't until all this stuff started happening in 2014 that you started seeing a flood of interest. And it's just like a dollar short and a day late kind of situation. So hopefully we can get them to recommit to the North Carolina project, and the public stays committed to the project themselves and sort of encourages the Fish and Wildlife Service to move forward.
Okay, that appears to be it for our questions. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you to Joey for joining us as well to share his expertise on the Red Wolf program and the recovery challenges. If you do have any other questions that maybe you think of after this, feel free to send us an email at the Wolf Conservation Center. We would be happy to answer any questions you might have. But again, thank you all for joining. And as a reminder, the public comment period is open through the end of July 30th. We do have a link on our website that will take you to the page where you can leave your comment. We also have suggested talking points as well, but feel free to use anything you might have learned from Joey's talk to support your comments as well. Again, thank you all for joining.
Yep. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.